So let's get started. So you may, in our American culture in 2022, you may have heard people talk about faith and science like this. Okay, so I'm going to describe to you. So, especially once you go to college, hold it.
You are a science teacher, right?
Yeah, I was.
Oh.
I got demoted. Now I'm like more like a principal. It's a terrible
So
job.
it was more of like a
Worst mistake I
step up.
ever made. Wish I could go back to being a science teacher right now. So that's why we're doing this. Midlife crisis. You guys get to experience it. When you talk about science, especially when you go to college, like I was a biology major in college, and so when you hear secular people, like in most colleges, if you're not going to Christian college, when you hear them talk about faith and science, there's a very common misconception that people have. A lot of times as a science teacher, I'd run into a high school kid who had the same misconception. He'd be like, wait, he'd just be sitting there, 3 months into class, he kind of got to know me, and my kids are all named after people in the Bible, and Young Life, and Bible, maybe they've heard about church, and you kind of hear about it when someone's a Christian and they're around you for an hour every day. And he'd look at me and he'd go, Mr. Olkers, you're a Christian, but you're a science teacher. That doesn't work. Right? Like that was a very common interaction I had as a science teacher for 14 years, where a kid would just go, those two things don't go together, Mr. Olkers. You're a walking contradiction. And another way that you'll hear scientific people who love science and kind of are wholeheartedly following after science even for their religious pursuits, they'll kind of give this, it's really a pathetic idea that no one who's a Christian embraces. But these scientific people will say, oh, well, faith is for like when you don't have any evidence but you believe something anyways, but science is when you just know what's true and what's reality and the facts, right? And that's kind of the box that the secular world who doesn't know much about Christianity wants to put us in. Oh, Christians are those dumb people who believe things despite the evidence, And that is completely, historically, and even in the modern world, completely inaccurate. That is not how science works, exactly, and that's definitely not how Christians work. And so tonight, before we get into all this scientific evidence that we're going to go over, and if you go back and look at the lessons that I'm going to go with, we're going to talk about, like week 2, we're going to talk about the Big Bang, okay, so which is basically about where did the universe come from, okay? And then we'll have another week about the universe and what they call the fine-tuning of the universe, and there's this major problem for atheists called the fine-tuning problem. And then we'll get into life. So these two are about the universe and astronomy. And we'll get into life and pretty much hang out there the rest of the time. Where did life come from? The origin of life is another major problem for atheists. And then there's a few things that have come out of what's called the intelligent design movement, ID for short, intelligent design. And it's a more secular version of theism. And theism is just short for belief in God. So like Jews are theists, Muslims are theists, Christians are theists. And then we'll talk a little bit about geology and the Cambrian explosion, which is another major problem in an evolutionary worldview. And then we're going to talk about something that's a little more interesting, related to more like spirituality and like, is there evidence that people have a soul and that we're not just made out of atoms and molecules? And that'll be the last week on near-death experiences. And so today, before we get into all those 7 other evidences that I was just talking about, I want to talk about first, like, where did science come from? Why is there science? And is it some sort of contradiction to be a Christian and also think that science is a way of knowing things? And so what I just described to you just a second ago is not science. That belief that people have that faith is for people who don't use evidence and logic and reason, and science is how you know everything is true, and it's the only way you can determine what's true and real. That idea is called scientism, and it's actually more like a religion. So it's S-C-I-E-N-T-I-S-M, scientism. And a lot of people walk around either believing in this wholeheartedly or having heavily been influenced by scientism. And it says right here, scientism is the idea that the only way to gain knowledge of reality is through the hard sciences. You guys know there's only probably 2 hard sciences. Do you know what they are? Brent is going to know what one of them is. What's one of the hard sciences? Like the most scientific sciences. Physics and chemistry. Those are really like,
Amen.
even biology. Amen. Even biology is like, it's pretty hard science. Like it's pretty rock solid, like only observations, only facts. But even biology doesn't quite get to be quite as hard as chemistry and physics. And it doesn't mean hard like, man, those classes are hard in high school. It means like rock solid conclusions, okay? And so I don't know if I can describe this well to you because I didn't have time to prepare for this because the copy machine didn't work for like 27 minutes, more like 2 hours before. So you should feel very thankful that I hand stapled each one of those for you because the copy machine was not working. And do you like my cute little pictures? Like who here is really, really not a big fan of science class in school? Okay, yeah. And so those cute pictures are for you.
It doesn't like
Okay, those pictures are for you, Joanne. So here's a way that you know scientism is called self-refuting. What do you think self-refuting means? The belief that science is the only way to know things it's actually a self-refuting statement. It is in itself logically contradictory. Okay, what do you guys think that means? Self-refuting. In the definition, you can tell it's not true. It contradicts itself. The very claim, science is the only way to gain knowledge of reality, is not a scientific claim. So it is a self-refuting idea. So scientism is not a logical belief, but it's a belief that has become very popular in our society, as it's just so much easier to reject things that are less certain than the observations of your eyes, basically. So what I described to you earlier was scientism. Science itself actually came from Christians. Did you guys know that? Science could have come from Buddhism. Science could have come from India, where they believe in millions of gods. Science could have come from atheists or some other interesting place in history. But the place where modern science actually got its traction and took off is from 16th century Europe that was heavily Christian Europe. And atheists don't usually like to admit that. And if they do admit that, they're going to say, oh, it's just a total coincidence. Kind of like life spontaneously appearing out of some little pool of molecules. Oh, it's just an amazing coincidence that it happened like that. You know, oh, science came out of Christianity. Just totally contrary to what should have happened. It's just total coincidence. Like the universe just exploded out of nothing. Just a really weird coincidence. Or maybe Christianity actually is part of the reason science came out of that time period. And so here's 3 guys who were 3 of the most important and influential scientists around that time, who you may have heard of, who also I could find pictures of on the internet that were cute. Okay, so first one has, in case you can't tell what that is, what is that? That's a telescope. Guy from 1600s has a telescope, also has a sweet white collar thing that he's always pictured with. Anybody know? Galileo. Okay, so this is Galileo. You guys know what Galileo kind of discovered? Like what he's famous for? First guy to maybe second guy to popularize this idea. That the Earth, Joanne, is this what you do in science class in high school too? That the Earth is not the center of the solar system. That's right. And he had a lot of trouble with that. But one thing that's interesting about Galileo, motions and math. Listen to my little quote from Galileo here. Galileo said, the laws, and he used math to figure it out, and observation. And it says, Galileo says, the laws of nature are written by the hand of God in the language of mathematics. Now, many of you just went cross-eyed. You're like, how do you take math and make sense of planetary motions? I don't even particularly know, because I'm not that nerdy on that side of things. But that's what he was into. But Galileo did not think, oh, because God doesn't exist, I'm going to be really good at science. Galileo said, because there is a rational creator behind the universe, I believe there are laws. Even this language we use in science class, where we talk about the law of gravity or Newton's 3 laws of motion, they're called laws because the Old Testament rules were also called laws. And who came up with those rules? God. And who came up with the rules that the universe has to obey? God. That's why they're called laws. Because Christians thought that there was philosophy or theology about God, but there was also natural philosophy about nature that God made, and that God is rational and gave us rational minds, and we could go and understand the creation that he made. Another guy who has a piece of bacon in his hand, who you've never heard of probably. Anybody know? His name is his little symbol. Bacon. He didn't actually invent bacon, but his name is Francis Bacon. And I put a piece of bacon because he didn't actually invent or discover anything in particular. There's no reason that bacon is called bacon because of him. I just thought it would be fun to put a piece of bacon in his hand. But he was the guy who really, if anybody's the father of modern science, it's actually this guy named Bacon, which would be a great last name. And Bacon said that the best way to know what's true about reality, the physical universe, is to go out and actually do experiments. And that one idea that he had to go out and do experiments was kind of the revolutionary idea that caused what's called the scientific revolution. Because for thousands of years, the Greeks were philosophers, and they thought they could figure everything out by sitting around and talking and doing philosophy, and they could figure out the laws of nature just by being smart and talking to each other and philosophizing. And so that was a really bad idea. And the Greeks had that idea, and it got passed down for a couple thousand years. But then, given the environment that he was in, Bacon said, let's go out and actually do experiments. And that's what actually started the scientific revolution. Now, here's what Bacon has to say about God. I love this quote. A little science inclines man's heart toward atheism. So and this is what I think the average atheist, this is where I think they're at. They've gotten a little bit of knowledge. They've gotten a little taste of knowledge. And so their heart has been inclined toward atheism. They've gone that direction. But then he says, but death brings him back. That's good. I like that. And then here, this guy with the apple. You guys all know this guy, right? They made you learn about him in middle school. Big Newton. Big Newtons. Okay, so this is Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton, in my opinion, and probably in the opinion of a lot of people, is probably the greatest scientist who ever lived. He probably achieved more in his lifetime than anybody before or after him. And Newton was a crazy theist. Like, he really, really believed in God, just like these other two guys. And he was a Christian. And here's what he has to say about God. And this was in his Principia Mathematica, which was this giant book he wrote that is super famous, where he came up with all the laws, basically all the physical laws of motion. And he said, this most beautiful system of sun and planets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an all-powerful being. What do you think he's talking about? God. Joanne, you're getting it. Good job. So these guys were really a huge part of what was called the scientific revolution, which was a 16th century period when Christian scholars changed scientific thought. That's called the scientific revolution. And so where did science come from? It came from a Christian revolution in thought. So what a contradiction to say Christians have faith, and that's where they don't use their brains, but scientists have science. You know, that is an absolute contradiction of reality because science came from Christians. And the word science comes from the Latin word, which the Bible was written in Latin, and it just means knowledge. So science literally just means knowledge, a way of knowing what's true. And it's gotten used nowadays to say how to know what's true about physical reality. Okay? Now, I was mentioning these guys, and I wasn't talking necessarily about them being Christians, and this is going to be a word you're going to hear me say a lot. But I said they are Christians. But another word I used to describe that, belief in God? Theist. Okay? So an atheist is a non-theist. You put an A in front of a word, it means non. Okay? And so a theist, Theist, theist. A theist is someone who believes in theos, God. And theology is the study of God. Okay? And someone who believes that all that exists in the universe is matter and energy, we would call them an atheist, and leave room for yourself, an atheist. Or all they believe exists, Joanne, is physical material objects. And so another word that gets used for them a lot is materialist. All they believe in is material. And so they're called materialists. Now, in our culture, do you guys know what the word materialism tends to mean? Like when you talk about it in like general language, like so materialistic. Materialism. The obsess of things. Like I want stuff. I want an Oculus, and I want an Xbox, and I want a four-wheeler, and I want a big house. You're a materialist. All you care about is stuff, right? But in science, when you talk about a materialist, you're talking about someone who doesn't believe there's anything in the universe except for the physical materials that we can touch. Okay? Now, what exactly did these Christians develop? It was basically going out and actually measuring things. And the way you do this is through making observations. Okay? Observations. And so we're going to make, I'm going to teach you, there's one other word I'm going to teach you. And so we're going to draw a little picture here. And Joanne, I expect you to have the best picture. Observations, do you guys get that? Okay, so we're going to draw a little picture here at the bottom. And I got to hurry up here. So here is a footprint. And we see these big footprints walking in this direction, okay? And right about now, they start getting further apart. Oh, wait. Okay, they start getting further apart. And then we also see these little footprints. And they are not going to get further apart. You guys see my footprints all right? Okay. You're just going to stay the same distance apart. Okay. So draw those footprints. And now here's what I want you to do. I want you, Jenny, do you remember this in Mr. Olker's biology class? No? Sounds good. I couldn't remember if I don't think I taught this in honor class. I want you, after you draw the footprints, okay, we got the little ones right there, and then we got the big ones, and then they get further apart. You guys see that? Okay. I want you to make an observation of what is going on in this picture, and I want you to tell the person next to you what you think. You're good at this game. You've done this before, I think. Did your teacher in Redmond teach you this? Did you go to school in Redmond?
Nope, I didn't know about that.
Have you seen this picture before? Like, obviously.
I have not. That's just what I got from it.
Oh, you've already got the right answer. I haven't even drawn the whole picture. Okay. All right, now we're going to draw some more. Are you guys ready?
Actually, is that good?
You're that good. Okay, now we're going to draw some more. You guys ready? Now these footprints are going to do this. And they're going to kind of go all over the place like this. Okay, these are all the little footprints. Okay. And then the big footprints are going to come over here like this. And they're going to do a little bit of this. And like that. Okay. All right. Next up. So draw the new encounter that we saw. Okay. Holden's like, I got this. I got this figured out. Okay. Joanne, this was supposed to be your moment to shine. People who don't like science are supposed to like art, Joanne. See? Okay, now, again, I want you to find a different person, so like turn to the other side. And Claire and Liza, you need to get up and go talk to each other. Okay? Turn to the other side and tell the person who you didn't tell yet what's going on in this picture. Make an observation of this picture. Nailed it. Okay. All right, let me hear from you. Okay, let me hear from you.
Geez, too dark.
All right. Joanne, being the scientific person that you are, what was your observation?
The friends were going on their own paths and then they met and something happened.
That was the lamest observation. Holden, what was your observation?
There was a big bird, see? There's also a small bird. I believe, just an assumption here, she's on something else. So the small bird was attacked by the big bird, and then the big bird flew off.
Okay, there you go. Okay, other observations? Yeah.
The big bird started running, and that's why the feet started getting farther, and the feet started getting farther.
Oh, there you go. That's a good observation right there. Okay, Claire, future scientist right there. Claire Smith. She's going to marry a guy with the last name Smith. Just a little prophecy over your life right there. Hey, good news. That's like the most common thing. You got a lot of options. Okay, Claire, what did you think? Okay. Liza? Okay.
Except for it's not
Dancing! There we go! Dancing. There's usually three options that I hear. Fighting, dancing, and piggyback ride, but that comes out later. Okay, so, all right. So, now here's the lesson. I've tricked you this whole time. You guys have been, except for actually Joanne's lame observation was actually a real observation. Okay? Everybody else was not making observations. And it was a trick. The way I said things, I said I want you to make an observation of what's going on. Now that's a total contradiction in terms right there. Okay? So an observation, if you look back at our notes over here, an observation is, let me zoom in. Well, that's a really fast zooming in function. An observation, Joanne, can you read it to me? I'm just going to pick on Joanne all day today.
What are we reading?
Observation. What's an observation, Joanne? I should have done that.
Collecting facts, the use of the sense and
Technology. Okay, so collecting facts through your senses is observation. Like, if I walk over here to Jacob McKinnon, and I'm like, I'm going to do some observations here. Fluffy. Okay.
Buffy. Stuffy.
No, I'm kidding, you smell great.
Whoa.
Only kind of great.
Good.
So those are observations, right? So what would actually be observations here? And even Joanne had, I think Joanne may have. Now I told you this, so it could be an observation. But these aren't actually footprints. What are they?
birds, people.
No, not birds or people.
Sticks.
Not sticks.
Lines.
Lines from a pencil, on a TV, through an HDMI cable, coming from a projector that I drew on. It's graphite, right? That's an observation. Now, I kind of started using the word footprints immediately, right? So then it was like, okay, I can assume these are footprints because Johnny's telling me these are footprints. So it's kind of an observation, kind of not, right? So, observations don't get to have your opinion in them. Observations don't get to have what you think in them. Observations are just the facts, okay? And so that is a new idea in science. And it's really, Einstein said that science is human thinking refined. And so like the natural way that we think rationally, let's make it super accurate. That's called science. and let's make it about only the things that are always happening the same, which is the physical world. And so let's only make observations about matter, atoms and molecules, energy changes, and that kind of stuff. And that's called chemistry and physics. Okay? And that is rock solid stuff because it never changes. It's pretty predictable, like in terms of, it's easy to manipulate for us, you know? You can go stab dirt, you can go heat up dirt to 200 degrees, it's not going to complain, right? And so the hard sciences are the easy sciences because you can actually manipulate this stuff. You can do science with other things like human behavior. That's called a soft science, like psychology, sociology. What are the trends? Economics. What are the patterns of how people spend money? But the hard sciences are chemistry and physics. So when I said make an observation of what's going on, I was actually pushing you toward another way of knowing. There is more to knowing than just observation. There's also what's called inference. Okay? And so another huge way to know things that is still considered science, but is less certain, is called inference. Sorry, you can't read that very well. And then inference is an educated guess based on observations. Okay? Now, everything I was trying to get you to spit out right now was actually an inference. Okay? Now we're going to draw one more picture. Inference. We're going to draw one more picture. Here you go. Ready for the end of the picture? Now let's say that I tell you that these drawings that I'm making on paper, let's say that I tell you these are actually fossil footprints that have been found at the bottom of a rock layer in eastern Washington. Okay? So we're going to call these fossil footprints. And that's actually the name of this little activity that I've done almost every year I've been a teacher to teach about the nature of science. Fossil footprints, okay? So let's say these are fossilized footprints or fossilized markings that have been found in a rock layer in eastern Washington. Now if that's true, if these are fossilized markings that are found in a rock layer in eastern Washington, and they're the size of a bird's footprint, and they're the shape of a bird's footprint, what would be some interesting inferences that you could make based on these footprints? What?
Big bird eats small bird.
So your inference is the big bird ate the small bird and walked away. Okay? Come on. Oh. Remember the one I said earlier?
Yeah, the big bird gave the little bird a piggyback
The
ride.
big bird gave the little bird a piggyback ride. That is the most peaceful, friendly option.
And then many little birds were born from the piggyback ride.
That is the biological option. That's the reproductive option. Okay? And it goes on and on, right? So what are some pieces of evidence that you could use to support a more violent hypothesis? And I think you mentioned one earlier.
The footprints are spaced farther apart, so the bigger bird had the bigger footprints, I should say.
Yeah, right here. You see this?
Running.
You see that, Joanne? That, to me, looks like this bird was walking along, and then this bigger bird saw him, but he didn't see him, and then he started running at the little bird. Probably not because he wanted to give him a piggyback ride, but because he wanted to eat him. Okay? And then this, and then here's another one. Like there must have been some interaction here. And then this guy walked away, but there's nowhere where the little guy ever walked away. If they were dancing, where did the other one walk away?
On the other bird.
But then again, if he's a bird, maybe he flew away, right? Do you think there's enough evidence here to really come to a conclusion you can feel totally certain about?
No.
No. Do you think if we could go there and witness these things, that we might be able to come to a confident conclusion that they're footprints? Yeah, like especially if there's birds alive today that make the exact same shape, and we have those birds come and walk in mud, and then we look at the shape and see if it's the same. We might be able to get to a point where we say, yeah, these are definitely bird footprints. and feel really confident about that. But it may not be possible to know whether or not it was a fight, or a reproduction event, or a piggyback ride, or a dance, or maybe there was some dead animal here that they were both eating on and the one flew away. Maybe they didn't even come at the same time. Maybe this was 2 days apart, you know? There's all kinds of ways to explain it still. So that's called inference. Now, in order to make inferences, you have to do what Holden said earlier. Holden said, oh, I'm just kind of making an assumption here that this bird ate that bird. And we call those in science presuppositions. We presuppose. Well, suppose that one bird saw the other bird. You know, suppose this happened. We call those presuppositions, or assumptions. And all science requires this kind of stuff. And you can have two sets of data that are explained pretty well by two different sets of presuppositions. So if I suppose that the earth is extremely old, and if I suppose that all things have continued naturally since the beginning of time, just as they are now, and if I suppose that, you know, blah, 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 I might be able to get to where I believe in atheism. But if I suppose that, you know, the earth is relatively young, or I suppose that the universe seems to have a cause, and I make a few of my own presuppositions, I might end up at theism. And it's just kind of why we have two different groups of people who think two different things, because they really start with different presuppositions to begin with, based on what they want. Okay? Now, the more, last couple things I'm going to tell you, and then I'll be quiet, because I definitely think I talked for 30 minutes. I apologize for that. The science that is like most trustworthy is called hypothesis testing. Hypothesis testing. And hypothesis testing is what is also sometimes called the scientific method, where you literally make a prediction, Joanne. Joanne, just make any prediction.
What?
Okay? You make a prediction, and then you try it out and see what happens. You literally do the test, you do the experiment, and you see what happens. It's just basically observations, completely observations, and you just can actually physically see what happens in reality. That is the science that gives us cell phones and satellites and televisions and the Oculus and the internet and all the, you know, open heart surgeries and all the cool things of modern technology, okay? That is what we call the scientific method. But then there's a whole other chunk of science that, in my opinion, doesn't really deserve to be called science. But if you are going to call it science, you should really clarify that this is totally different than the science that gives us open heart surgery and satellites. And it's called inference to the best explanation. Now that's way too long to fit in there. Inference to the best explanation. Now this is actually what I would call Christian faith. This is how faith works. We have a bunch of evidence, empty tomb, post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and you could go on. And we have historical evidence, that verifies that this document is real and from the right time period, and that these people knew all the details of that. And we have all this evidence, and we say, what is the best explanation for the crucifixion of Jesus, the empty tomb, and the post-mortem appearances, the disciples willing to go to their death with this message? What is the best explanation for all that stuff? What can we infer based on all that evidence? Well, I think we can infer that Jesus rose from the dead. And that is like kind of a step of faith. Like, I believe that Jesus rose from the dead because of all the evidence for it. And so inference to the best explanation is also the way that, like, evolution versus creation gets argued about. We're not dealing with stuff in the present. We're not making predictions and testing things and looking at observations. We're looking at historical data, and we're making claims about the past and trying to convince other people whether we're right or not. Okay? And so, because you have these two different kinds of science, or these two different ways of doing science, you kind of have two different kinds of science. You have a science called observational science. where basically the conclusions you make are based on observations. And there might be some inferences in there sometimes when you can't stick your hand inside of something and you can't actually see what's happening inside of a little black box or something. But it's heavily based on observation, whereas historical science is much less about making observations, although you still have to interpret observations. But historical science is much more about making inferences to try to best explain the past. And so when we talk about something like, does God exist? And as we get into all these details about the Big Bang and the origin of life and the Cambrian explosion and irreducible complexity, what we're really doing is a totally different kind of science than observational science. But when atheists do the same thing and believe that God doesn't exist and that's the only scientific view possible, they're actually being dishonest and they don't even know it. They are confusing observational science with historical science. And they're saying, oh, how could you Christians not believe in evolution? Well, that's because evolution isn't an observable thing like how you can create a cell phone by doing lots of experiments and trying out different things. Evolution is a historical science. The Big Bang is a historical science. The question of whether or not God exists based on the scientific evidence is a historical science. And although you are being very intelligent and using lots of data to make inferences, you do not get to draw the same confidence of conclusions that you do when you do observational science. And so we're going to get into all of the historical inferences involved and all the historical data from the past that's involved to talk about these things as we go further. I apologize for how much talking that was. It felt like a lot. Did it feel like a lot? Good. Joanne's like, oh my gosh, I can barely breathe right now. Johnny, there's so many ideas in my head that I can't, my heartbeat is forgetting to heartbeat. Don't worry, that's what your brainstem is for. Okay, so now, you can answer the big question or you can just wonder about the big question. I was thinking that, so I'm going to record each one of these because I want to get better at this, and I want to maybe someday post videos to YouTube as a way to reach people. But first I have to experiment on you guys and see how much I talk too much in one place or another. And I also want to give you the opportunity, Brent. I bet Brent enjoyed this tonight. Did you enjoy this? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And remind me of your name, dude.
David.
I think David enjoyed this tonight. Because, guys, I hate to tell you this, Brent and David, but you're kind of like me, probably, and kind of scientifically minded, and you like this kind of nerd stuff. It's okay, though. There's a place for us in the world, too. So, in case Brent or David's ever gone, or anybody else who's secretly nerdy and likes this stuff, I'm going to record all of these and probably put them on a YouTube channel, just so that you can, if you miss a week, you can go back and oh, I missed lesson number 4, and you can go and watch it if you want to, okay?